My parents gave my ungrateful brother the entire inheritance after I quit my job to care for them. I quit my job to care for my parents in their old age. It was a decision I made without hesitation, without setting conditions, without expecting anything in return, or so I thought at the time. I was 34 years old, had a stable work life, a decent income, and although I did not consider myself rich, I had worked hard enough to support myself without any surprises. I had been working for years at an international logistics company, and while it was not my dream job, I had managed to climb the ranks and earn the respect of my superiors. I lived alone in a small rented apartment, and like many people my age, my life revolved around work routines, occasional friends, and a family with whom, although I was not extremely close, I maintained a functional and respectful bond. My elderly parents began to show signs of physical decline almost simultaneously. My mother was diagnosed with advanced rheumatoid arthritis, which made it difficult for her to move freely. And my father, on the other hand, was the one who caused us the most concern. The diagnosis was clear and brutal: terminal pancreatic cancer. It was then that, without anyone suggesting it, much less asking for it, I made the decision to leave everything behind. I had always been the responsible son, the one who was there when needed, the one who did not cause problems, and the one who never raised his voice. They let me know this throughout my life, and on more than one occasion, I felt that, without even seeking it, I had been placed on that uncomfortable pedestal of the model son. My brother, on the other hand, lived a different story. He always felt that I occupied a preferential place in the family, that he was condemned to live in my shadow. Years ago, during our adolescence, it was not uncommon for him to say to me, by way of reproach, and with the weary tone of someone who has repeated the same argument dozens of times, "Everything is easy for you, but I have to break my back to get noticed." I never knew how to respond to those kinds of comments. They baffled me because, from my perspective, we had both received the same education, the same scoldings, the same roof. But as the years went by, I came to understand that he carried a resentment that had nothing to do with objective realities, but with how he interpreted every gesture, every word from our parents. My father's illness precipitated everything. I sold my car, canceled my apartment lease, ended cycles at work, and informed them that I would be away indefinitely. I moved into my parents' house, an old but well-maintained home located in a quiet area with tall trees and quiet neighbors. It was not an easy transition. I went from having total independence to becoming a full-time caregiver, dealing with diapers, medications, mood swings, therapies, medical procedures, and sleepless nights. I did it without expecting praise. My only consolation was knowing that if my father's time was limited, at least I would be by his side and could ensure that he had dignity in his last months of life. During that process, my brother would appear and disappear. He would come some weekends, ask superficially how things were going, and after a few minutes of banal conversation, return to his routine. Sometimes I noticed him uncomfortable when he saw me attending to our parents. He would tell me, with that sour tone he could not hide, that I always had to be the good one, right? And that he did not have the luxury of leaving everything for a noble cause. He would talk to me about his debts, his unstable job, his need to support himself. I, who was also surviving on what little savings I had left and selling some personal belongings, chose not to argue. I did not want to enter into his logic of competition or his eternal victim narrative. But it was one afternoon, while preparing my parents' snack and listening to my mother talk on the phone with a distant cousin, that something in her conversation made me stop dead in my tracks. She mentioned, in a relaxed tone, that everything was in order with the will, and that they had already arranged everything so that Marcos, my brother, would not have to worry about anything in the future. I stood motionless for a few seconds. I did not say anything at that moment, but that phrase kept going around in my head like an invisible thorn. That night, as soon as I could, I approached my mother with a pounding heart and asked her directly if it was true that they had left everything to Marcos. Her answer was as blunt as it was disconcerting. She told me, without looking me in the eyes, that I had made the decision to take care of them, but that did not give me the right to expect anything in return. "We did not ask you to do it," were her exact words, with a coldness that chilled me to the bone. I wanted to think it was some kind of misunderstanding, that perhaps she was talking about a specific property or a minor procedure. But upon further inquiry, they confirmed, without hesitation, that the will did indeed favor my brother entirely. They justified that decision with arguments that seemed twisted to me, that he needed more financial help, that he had had more difficulties than I, that I was strong and would know how to get ahead on my own, as if my whole life of effort and sacrifice were a condemnation to receive less, as if doing things right were, in itself, a disadvantage. The most hurtful thing was not the fact itself, but the way they normalized it, the way they spoke to me as if I were an irrational adult for expecting some kind of recognition. My brother, upon learning that I knew the truth, wasted no time in rubbing it in my face that justice was finally being served, and said sarcastically, "You will probably find a way to get ahead anyway, because you always do everything right, don't you?" His words were a reminder of all the resentment he had accumulated over decades, and that now, with my father's death ever closer, he seemed to feel justified in claiming as a historical debt. And so it was that, amidst my father's physical decline and my mother's increasingly prolonged silences, I came to understand that this story had no absolute heroes or villains, that love does not always translate into gratitude, and that sacrifices do not guarantee justice. However, something inside me broke that night, and I knew that this chapter was not yet closed. Because even though they believed that everything had been said and decided, I still had something to say. And I was not going to stand idly by and watch as history placed me, once again, in the place of the one who gives in, the one who keeps quiet, the one who understands too much. This time it was going to be different. And although I still did not know how or when, the only thing I knew for sure was that, at some point, the consequences would come. Because sometimes revenge is not born of hatred, but of the accumulated weariness after years of poorly repaid loyalty. Update 1. 2 weeks had passed since that night when my mother, without any remorse, confirmed to me that all the family assets had been destined solely for my brother. And although outwardly I tried to maintain my composure, internally a kind of constant emptiness began to form, a feeling of displacement that was unlike anything I had experienced before. It was not about the money itself, not even about the properties or material goods that, for years, I helped keep in order. It was the weight of a crueler truth. I had dedicated my time, my mental health, my resources, and even my dignity to the care of those who, when the time came, decided that I was not part of the final equation. The days became increasingly heavy. My father, whose health had entered a practically irreversible phase, could barely utter a word. His body, increasingly thin, clung to life with a mixture of stubbornness and fragility that made it impossible for me to ignore the passage of time. Between administering his medications, preparing the specific meals he could tolerate, carrying out the changes of position in bed, and keeping his medical records up to date, I was also dealing with a silent tension in the environment. Because, although the subject of inheritance was not discussed in that house, the presence of silence was so heavy that it could be felt in every corner. My mother avoided eye contact every time I approached with a tray of food or when I asked her something related to the management of the household. She would answer with monosyllables, as if she feared that any misplaced word would rekindle a discussion that she preferred to keep buried. On more than one occasion, I tried to build a bridge, at least to understand if there was still room to reconsider what had been agreed, but I always encountered the same evasive attitude, as if the mere mention of the mat were an unforgivable offense. On one of those particularly exhausting days, while I was washing the sheets from my father's room, I heard my brother's voice from the living room. He had arrived unannounced, as he usually did, and brought with him his usual attitude of moral superiority. It did not take long for him to drop his sarcastic comments, disguised as harmless jokes, but loaded with poorly digested resentment. He commented, as if it were an irrefutable truth, that I had offered to play the martyr, and that now I could not come to claim anything. When I tried to explain to him that I was not looking for compassion or recognition, but simply to understand how such a unilateral decision was made, he interrupted me with a condescending smile and blurted out what he had clearly been accumulating for a long time, that all my life they saw me as the favorite, as the model son, the perfect example, the one who never made mistakes, while he had to endure disappointed looks, constant comparisons, and impossible expectations. According to him, His life was an eternal attempt to equal me, and consequently, he could never feel genuinely valued. For him, this inheritance was not a gift, but fair compensation for years of feeling displaced within his own family. I did not know what to say. As much as I tried to understand his perspective, I could not ignore the obvious injustice that had been committed. It was not my fault if my parents projected an idealized figure onto me, nor if he carried emotional wounds that he never wanted to confront maturely. What I did find unacceptable was that this resentment now translated into a tangible act of dispossession. Because that is what I felt, that they were stripping me, not only of the material, but also of the sense of belonging, as if all my years of loyalty and sacrifice had been invisible, as if I were simply a functional figure whose usefulness had expired. That night, I locked myself in the room where I had been sleeping since I returned to my parents' house. I sat in the chair in front of my old teenage desk, which still bore the marks of the years, and tried to write down everything I felt in a notebook, as if putting the words on paper could alleviate some of the accumulated pain. But all I managed to do was confirm that, for the first time in my life, I felt completely alone within my own family. My father was slowly wasting away between the medications and the illness. My mother seemed to have chosen silence as a shield, and my brother finally had what he had always wanted: validation and control. The idea of leaving began to take shape in my head. Not immediately, because I could not and did not want to abandon my father in that state, but I began to consider the possibility that my place in that family no longer existed, at least not in the way I had known it. I felt that I had crossed an invisible line, and that no matter what I did, nothing would ever be the same again. I began to imagine a future in which I could build something from scratch, without depending on broken bonds, without expecting anything from anyone, a future that, although painful to conceive, began to seem like the only viable option to recover what little was left of myself. Because if I had learned anything in those 2 weeks, it was that unrequited loyalty becomes a cage, and I had already spent too much time locked in it. Update 2. A little over a month had passed since that hurtful conversation with my brother, in which he made it clear that everything that was happening was, from his perspective, a kind of belated justice. During that time, my father's health deteriorated with overwhelming speed. Every morning, I woke up fearing to find him lifeless, and every night I went to bed with an exhausted body, but with the firm awareness that, at least on my part, there would be no moral debt whatsoever. I knew the end was near, although inside I was torn between the desire for him to no longer suffer and the selfish need to hold on to him a little longer, as if his physical presence were the only anchor that kept me tied to that house, to that role of committed son that I no longer knew if it had any real purpose. The day of his death was strangely silent. I found him in his room, his eyes empty, as if he had finally managed to escape from a body that no longer responded. There was no drama, no loud wailing, no heartbreaking cries. My mother, upon entering the room minutes later, approached the bed with the dull expression of someone who had already cried in silence long before the outcome arrived. She asked me to call the funeral services and sat by the bed, stroking my father's already inert hand with mechanical, almost detached movements. Organizing the funeral was an automatic process. I took care of everything: the wake, the coffin, the flowers, contacting the few friends who remained from his generation, dealing with the absurd bureaucracy that surrounds death. My brother appeared only a few hours before the service, without offering any help, but with his face carefully arranged for the occasion. He moved among those present with a faint smile, like someone playing a role in a play they do not fully understand. He greeted acquaintances with empty phrases, received condolences as if they were compliments, and in the moments when he thought no one was watching, I saw him check his phone with disinterest, as if that farewell had no emotional relevance for him. It was during the burial, at the end of the interment, when something happened that would mark a turning point in my perception of everything I had lived through up to that point. My mother, who had remained silent throughout the ceremony, approached me with slow steps and told me, without preamble, that she hoped I would respect my father's will, that he had been clear in his will, and that although the decisions made were not to my liking, I should understand that everything had been done for a reason. I stood there, speechless, while she turned and walked away to join some distant relatives who were waiting at the cemetery exit. I did not know why, but that phrase, so dry, so final, made me feel more orphaned than my father's own death. Because what my mother was telling me was not just a legal warning, but a confirmation that, even on his deathbed, my father had chosen to reinforce a family structure in which I no longer had a place. I struggled to understand it. It hurt me deeply. How was it possible that, after everything I did for him, after being by his side day and night during the worst moments, the only thing he wanted to leave me was a cold note in a will? What about the childhood hugs, the Sunday afternoons talking about music and literature, the advice he gave me when I started my first job? How did all of that dissolve into a legal signature that left everything in the hands of my brother, as if I had never existed? That night, after returning to the family home, I searched through the drawers of my father's desk. I did not know what I was looking for, a letter, a document, some clue that would help me understand his logic. And I found it, in a white envelope, without a sender, with my name written in his firm but aged handwriting. Inside, there was a short, handwritten note with words I will never forget. In it, my father tried to justify his decision, explaining that he always considered me self-sufficient, that he saw me as someone strong, capable of rebuilding myself from ashes if necessary, and that, on the contrary, he always felt that my brother was fragile, unstable, incapable of supporting himself. He said that by leaving everything to him, he was not punishing me, but freeing me from the burden of having to rescue him again and again. That his decision was a way to protect me from the emotional wear and tear, from the perpetual obligation of being the lifeguard of a brother who did not know how to swim alone. Upon finishing reading that letter, I did not know whether to tear it up or keep it. It was a strange mixture of understanding and anger, of compassion and resentment. Part of me understood what my father had wanted to do. Perhaps he thought that with this decision, he would avoid future conflicts, that he was setting me free to live without the shadow of family responsibility. But another part, one that I could not silence, felt that I had been punished precisely for being strong, for being reliable, for not having caused problems, as if my virtues had been turned into reasons to exclude me. I stayed awake until dawn, alone in the living room, with the letter in my hands and my head full of unanswered questions. I realized at that moment that it was not just about an economic inheritance, but something much deeper, about the emotional inheritance, about the recognition, about the closure that I had not been allowed to have. I also knew that, although I could understand his reasons, I was not obligated to accept them as fair. And it was in that silence, accompanied only by the sound of the wall clock and the echo of my thoughts, that I began to construct the idea of my own closure. One that would not be in any will, nor in any handwritten note, nor in any conversation with my mother or my brother. It would be mine, only mine. And it would not be about reconciliation, but about recovery, because there are wounds that are not closed with explanations, but with decisions. And I was beginning to make mine. Update 3. 6 months after my father's funeral, the family home had been transformed into a kind of stage frozen in time, where every corner preserved the echo of a routine that no longer existed. The rooms remained closed for days, the curtains were barely opened, and silence had become the most painful constant in the environment. My mother continued to live there, clinging to a way of life that was slowly crumbling without her seeming to notice, or perhaps she noticed, but simply refused to accept it. I, for my part, no longer lived in the house permanently. I had decided, with great effort, to accept a temporary job in another city, far enough away to breathe without the weight of family contempt suffocating me, but close enough to be able to return if something happened to my mother. My departure was discreet, without drama or elaborate goodbyes. I packed my things one Sunday morning, put them in the trunk of a car I rented for the day, and left, after leaving a simple note on the dining room table. There were no calls or messages from my mother in the following days, nor from my brother. It was as if, by leaving, I had confirmed for them that I had no right to expect anything more, not even the courtesy of a word. Upon arriving at my new job, I made an effort to stay focused. The work was absorbing and allowed me, at least during the day, to occupy my mind with something other than resentments and disappointments. But at night, when the silence of my new apartment enveloped me, everything came back. The memory of my father's note, my mother's empty gaze, my brother's cynical words, and above all, that feeling of having been set aside simply for being reliable. However, the distance also gave me perspective. Little by little, I began to see more clearly the family dynamics that previously seemed confusing to me. I began to notice how, for years, my brother had constructed a narrative that allowed him to justify his failures without taking responsibility. How my mother had fostered, perhaps unintentionally, a structure where the blame for another's success fell on the one who achieved it. And how my father, with his clumsy attempt to protect us both, ended up validating an emotional inequality that had existed long before he died. On one of my sporadic returns to the city, I went to visit my mother. It was not a planned visit. I simply felt that I should check on her. Upon arriving, I found her sitting on the same sofa where my father used to sleep in his last months, with the television on at a low volume and her gaze fixed on some invisible point. She greeted me with some surprise, but without joy. Her tone was neutral, almost bureaucratic, as if I were an occasional visitor and not her son. We talked about trivialities for a few minutes, but inevitably, I ended up asking her how things were going with the inheritance and the properties. I did it in a moderate tone, almost like someone asking about the weather, but her reaction was immediate. She lowered her gaze and began to speak evasively. It was then that I learned, thanks to a slip of the tongue, that my brother had started selling some of the properties he had inherited. It was no longer just a change of name on paper, but a systematic liquidation of what, for decades, had represented the family estate. According to her, he argued that he needed liquid money to invest in a project, and that they preferred not to have stagnant assets. At that moment, a pang of indignation ran through me, because although I no longer cared about getting anything back for myself, seeing how my brother squandered everything with the same irresponsibility with which he always lived was unbearable. Those lands, those houses, those savings that my father had accumulated over years of hard work were now coins in the hands of someone who never knew how to value what sacrifice meant. I tried to warn my mother. I told her, as calmly as possible, that she should be careful, that she should not sign anything without legal advice, that she should not allow him to drag her into decisions that could harm her. She initially tried to justify him, as she usually did, saying that he knows what he is doing, and that I should not worry so much about things that no longer concerned me. But in her voice, I detected something different, a note of doubt, of contained fear. I knew at that moment that something had begun to fracture in her perception of my brother, that perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to see what I had always seen, that he was not looking for stability or redemption, but validation through power, and that now that he had it, in the form of properties and money, he was not going to stop until everything was in ruins. That night, back in my apartment, I began to imagine how the end of this story would be. I was no longer driven by the desire for economic justice or the longing for recognition. What I felt now was a serene but firm determination. I would not allow my mother, however much she had failed me, to end up completely at the mercy of someone who was willing to sell even memories. And that meant increasing his bank account. I began to discreetly consult with a lawyer who was a friend of the family. I told him part of the situation, without too many details at first, and asked him what possibilities there were to intervene if irregularities began to appear. He told me that everything depended on the evidence, the signed documents, whether there was coercion or deception involved. I promised him that if anything else came to light, I would contact him again. I was not driven by revenge in the traditional sense, but by a kind of moral obligation that I had not been able to shake off, even after everything. I knew that I could not rescue my mother from her past decisions, but perhaps I could prevent the consequences from being irreparable. What they, and especially my brother, did not know was that the fact that I had left did not mean that I had given up. I was just waiting for the right moment. Because sometimes the best way to get revenge is not to confront directly, but to let time reveal who each person really is, and to be prepared to act when that inevitable collapse arrives. And that moment was getting closer and closer. Final update. Almost 2 years had passed since my father's death when the day finally arrived, when everything collapsed. It was not sudden. There was no sudden outburst or melodramatic scene worthy of a movie. What happened was rather the result of a slow but steady accumulation of small decisions, of petty acts disguised as cleverness, of arrogance sustained by the false certainty of impunity. My brother, convinced that he could manipulate our mother at will, that he could appropriate what did not belong to him with the backing of a will built on omissions and favoritism, had woven a web too flimsy to support the weight of his own lies. Everything began to fall apart when one of the buyers of the properties he had sold specifically, the farm located on the outskirts, decided to file a complaint with a notary after detecting irregularities in the documents. It was a family who had acquired the land with the intention of building a small ecological farm, but when they began the formal procedures, they found that the deeds were signed by someone who was not legally listed as the sole representative of the property. In short, my brother had presented documents that included my mother's signature when, in reality, she had never authorized that sale. It was an action as blatantly clumsy as it was dangerous, and that negligence was the entry point that allowed everything else to come to light. I was notified by the lawyer almost at the same time that my mother was called to testify. The police had already initiated a formal investigation for forgery and aggravated fraud. And although my mother initially tried to protect her son, the weight of the evidence and the fear of ending up involved in something even more serious forced her to tell the truth. During her statement, she confessed that she often signed papers without reading them, but that on other occasions, he simply gave her sheets already signed with her forged signature, assuring her that it was just internal paperwork. She admitted that she trusted him blindly, that she preferred not to ask questions, and that she never believed that her own son would be capable of deceiving her in that way. The news of my brother's preventive detention reached me one morning while I was having coffee in front of the window of my apartment. I remember that the sky was cloudy and a light drizzle covered the streets with that opaque veil that always seemed melancholic to me. The lawyer sent me a short, almost clinical message saying that he had been arrested at his home, and that during the search they found false documents, contracts with visibly altered signatures, and bank records showing irregular transfers from my mother's accounts to a series of companies with no real activity. I knew then that the time had come, not because I had planned it with such precision, but because, as with rotten structures, the slightest movement is enough for them to collapse on themselves. In the following days, my mother's house became a place of whispers. Relatives who had not been seen for years began to call, some to offer words of support, others to inquire with a tone disguised as concern. I attended every hearing. I was present at every step of the process, not out of a thirst for prominence, but because I knew that the time had come not to take a step back. I made sure that my mother had adequate representation so as not to be legally affected, but I also made it clear that I would not lend myself to cover up anything or save anyone's image. I did so with respect, but with the firmness of someone who no longer tolerates half-truths or veiled complicities. During his first hearing, my brother could barely look at me. He was handcuffed, his gaze lost, devoid of the air of superiority with which he had always moved. His lawyer tried to present a discourse based on the idea of mismanagement without malicious intent, but the evidence was too solid to support that narrative. I did not utter a word during that meeting. There was no exchange of glances or any gestures, but I knew that he understood perfectly what was happening. For the first time, it was not I who had to justify my position, nor who had to calm things down or mediate to avoid a major conflict. This time, it was he who had to face the consequences, without masks or lifelines. My mother, devastated, spent weeks immersed in a silence that she only interrupted to ask for details of the process. She apologized to me once, in tears, saying that she never imagined that the decisions she made out of love would end up causing so much damage. I did not know how to answer her at that moment, because although a part of me wanted to comfort her, another could not forget the way in which, at the time, she dismissed my warnings, how she minimized my sacrifice, and blindly defended the one who had now stripped her of everything. Still, I accompanied her in what was necessary. I helped her reorganize her finances, took her to talk to a new accountant, and made sure she never signed anything again without understanding every last clause. But I never stayed in that house again, nor shared a meal under that roof. Not out of resentment, but out of dignity. Some wounds do not require confrontation, only distance. At this point, my brother remains in custody awaiting trial. The charges against him are serious, and although his lawyer is trying to negotiate a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation and partial return of what was stolen, the truth is that his reputation, his false image of a self-made man, has been completely destroyed. Many of the friends he used to brag about have distanced themselves. The companies with which he claimed to do business have broken all ties. And he, who for years accused me of being the favorite and of living with unearned privileges, has ended up in the place that, although it sounds cruel, he seems to have built step by step with his own choices. I, for my part, have closed the chapter, not without pain, not without scars, but with the certainty that I did the right thing. I never sought revenge in the crudest sense, but I did long for a form of justice for a long time. And although this justice has come through legal channels, and not as emotional revenge, its effect has been just as powerful. It allowed me to recover something I thought was lost, the right to set boundaries, to say enough, to stop carrying other people's guilt. Today I live far from all of that. I keep my father's letter, not as a reminder of his mistake, but as a symbol that even the people we love can make profound mistakes. Sometimes, understanding that is the first step to healing. But what I will never do again is sacrifice my peace for bonds that do not offer me reciprocity. Sometimes you have to walk away to find yourself again. And when justice does its part, the silence that remains is not empty, it is peace. A peace that, after all, I earned with every sleepless night, with every ignored act of loyalty, and with every time I chose to stay when everyone else had already let me go.